Today is the last day of the liturgical year, and tomorrow, the first Sunday of Advent. We're going to be back here again in Boston. It's also the first Saturday. And then just a few considerations. Father, and Son, Holy Ghost, amen. The world will have its last day, the day of judgment. And we consider that day of judgment actually these 8 days. That is from this last Sunday, the 24th Sunday of Pentecost, until tomorrow, the first Sunday of Advent. Every one of us is going to face Christ. We're going to face Him, the most just judge. And every human being is going to face Him. Every nation faces Him. Every city faces Him. And remember that God speaks of the judgment of the nations, judgment of the cities, judgment of the families. And so everyone is going to face His judgment. And we consider that judgment in this day, the final day. Tomorrow, the first Sunday of Advent. The first Sunday of Advent, in fact, will be identical to last Sunday, the day of the judgment. That Christ is coming to judge the living and the dead. Remember, it's Jesus Christ who's coming. You know, very often times when you go into a trial, you know, you remember that like one of our parishioners says, you know, what's the difference between a good lawyer and a great lawyer? Well, a good lawyer is one who studied his law books really well, got straight A's in his law course, and the great lawyer, he's a friend of the judge. So if you're a friend of the judge, you're innocent. If you're a friend of the judge and you're the prosecutor, he's guilty. And so what is a good lawyer and a great lawyer? It's very helpful to know a little bit about the judge before we go to a judgment. And so is a judge a Mason? Is a judge a Satanist? Is a judge a just man? Is a judge a king? Is a judge God? We know who the judge is. It's Jesus Christ. And He is going to come in power and majesty on the last day to judge. And He is a most strict judge. But how do we prepare for this judge? What's necessary to be ready for His coming? The judge is coming. And remember that this judge, we know he's going to be very serious. And he's going to judge with 24 men. 12 representatives of the Old Testament, representing the 12 tribes, 12 of the great prophets, and 12 men from the New Testament, which are going to be the 12 apostles. And they're going to sit in the great seat of judgment. At the last day, the trumpet is going to blow, a real trumpet, that shall pierce the heart and ears of every man, every woman, every child. No one who is even deaf will escape the sound of this trumpet, and it will pierce the heart. It will prick the conscience. And the trumpet shall blow, and Christ shall come from the east even unto the west. So he will be coming from the east. He will be going unto the west. The west is the place of death. The east is the place of life, where the sun rises. He is coming from life. He is going to the place of death. And everyone is going to die. There will be no one that escapes death. The Protestants have the heresy. One of the Protestant heresies is the belief in the rapture. That there will be people on the last day who get taken up without death. No, this is wrong. He's going from the east even unto the west. The west is where the darkness is. The west is where the sun sets. The west is the place of death. And notice that our Lord Jesus Christ Himself chose death as the means to conquer Satan. He Himself was subject to death. And also, though you can still be a Catholic and believe the Blessed Virgin Mary did not die, you can believe that she only took a nap, this is the belief of the Easterns and not the belief of the West and not the truth. The truth is that Jesus Christ, that Blessed Virgin Mary, died, just like her Son died. She died of charity, but she died, and she truly died. Every single man died. And we know this also because St. Paul tells us it is given for all men to die, and after death, the judgment. There will be a day in which all men finally die, and that day is a judgment, and we're all preparing for that day. And our preparation is during our own lifetime. The first man to die was Abel, and Abel did not know that he should have lived to be 950 years old. He was only about 20, maybe 30 years old. So you do the math nowadays, he had a long life ahead of him. the 25-year-old Abel. He had at least 900 years. And one day he was taking care of his sheep, and he was brought to death early. He was brought to death by Cain, who envied him and hated him, and he was the first man to face death. And he was preparing for the final judgment. He was preparing for the judgment of God upon all men. And notice the judgment of Abel. What caused that first death? It was the most beautiful thing that caused that first death. It was a tragic death because even though Adam knew that death would come into the world, and Eve knew that death would come into the world, and Adam and Eve knew that there should be no death, but when they saw Abel's blood, and they saw he would not rise until the last day, which would be 6,000 years later, more than 6,000 years later, and there will be many more deaths, and in fact all would die, their heart was ripped out. But let's go back and visit that first death. Abel was a priest. Every man was given a priesthood in those days. He was a priest, and he was given to offer sacrifice. And his sacrifice was to take the sheep. He happened to raise, there are many animals you can raise. You can raise cows, you can raise goats, you can raise all kinds of creatures. He raised sheep. And as a shepherd, he took his greatest sheep and he offered it in a holocaust to God. He took what was his best and gave it to God. And because he took of his best and gave to God, because he gave worthy worship to God at the age of 25, because he loved God above all things, he died. He died because he was a priest. He died because he loved God. He died because he was a shepherd. And though we saw that death as something very tragic, in fact, it's a beautiful thing indeed. Come 2,000 years later, we'll find another shepherd who's going to die on a cross. Another one who's going to die worshiping his Father in his humanity and being God himself in his own divinity. And one who will be killed because he's a priest. A priest is a mediator between God and man. And he is one who brings down the gifts of God to man and brings man's gifts to God. He makes man's worthless gifts valuable. He makes God's infinite gifts small enough to be dissected and received by such weak and small sheep. And God the Son allowed himself to die on the cross. He remembered the blood of Abel. And what did he speak about this blood? Cain said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And God said to Cain in this first death, "The blood of Abel cries to heaven." And so death was from the very beginning seen as a punishment, but God chose that the very first death, which was caused by the sin of Cain, because of his pride, because of his pusillanimity, he took his most worthless wheat and gave it to God. He was weak and pusillanimous. He was envious. He also was a priest. An envious priest named Cain, because of his small heart, and because of his giving the least of the gifts to God, he killed Abel, and death came into the world. Now death has already been foreshadowed. Here already God shows, yes, it's tragic, Eve. You're burying your son 900 years before he should die. And you're burying your son too young. But don't you see there's innocence in his face? Don't you see there's beauty in his life? Cain will live many, many more years on this earth. He will live several hundred more years before Lamech kills him. He goes to death also and judgment. But Cain's life of hundreds of years longer than Abel is a curse. And Cain shall end in misery. Abel lived only 25 years. And his life is beautiful. And his life is judged in the most wonderful way. And death is already seen to be transferred from the very first death. We will probably note at the end of the world that the last death, the last one to die at the end of the world, shall be a saint. And the first one that died was a saint. And the most important death that happened in between, in the middle of time, was God the Son becoming man. And so death is not so terrible a thing. And when we go to death, we go to the judgment of our Lord Jesus Christ. How do we prepare for that judgment? Abel prepared, thinking he had 900 years. He could have lived out his misspent youth, but he didn't. He thought he had 900 years to prepare, or 900 more years, but he didn't. We are preparing for the judgment by the worship of God in our hearts. Preparing for the judgment by the love of God above all things. Preparing for judgment by taking the best of what we have and giving it to God. That's what Abel did. Now then came the New Testament. And God is preparing souls for judgment. We're all being prepared. The judge is coming. And he has rules. He's going to judge us according to those rules. How do we prepare for that sacred judgment? How many years do we have? Abel died 6,000 years ago. And he was preparing for the final judgment. And there are many billions that have died between the time of Abel's death and our day. And there will be more billions that shall die between our day and the end of the world. 7 billion people on the earth right now, and 7 billion of them are going to die. Every single one of them. And they're all going to face the judgment, and Christ is going to meet them coming from the east. Everyone who's going to meet coming from the east. He is coming from life. He's coming from the light of the sun. He's coming from light. He's coming from life. He's coming from truth. That's where he's coming from. And as the fathers tell us, we have two choices during our life. Face the east or turn to the west. If we turn to the west, we turn to death. We turn to sin. If we turn to the east, we turn to Christ and we turn to life. What are we going to do? We have to turn to the east. Now in the New Testament, our Lord Jesus Christ gave us 7 sacraments. We discuss much these 7 sacraments and worry about them in our times. These are 7 means to eternal salvation. 7 helps to help us through the 7 stages of life, from birth all the way to death, and to get us into the kingdom of heaven. We define a sacrament as an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. When we study sacramental theology, we ask the question, were there any kinds of sacraments in the Old Testament, particularly the necessary sacrament of baptism or some kind of penance? They committed sins in the Old Testament. Could they be forgiven? And they needed to enter the true church. Could they enter it? And we speak of the sacramentum naturae, the sacrament of nature, by which the fathers would take their children and they would offer them to God. The boys would be the means of circumcision, the girls no specific means, but to take a physical offering of the child to God. Like for instance, we have a blessing that we often do when a baby is born, which is not required by the church. But you take the baby and you give it to the priest, and the priest places the baby in front of the statue of Our Lady and holds the baby in the presence of the statue of Our Lady as a gift of the baby to Our Lady. This is a ceremony that we often do. It is not a ceremony of the church. We could say it's like a sacramentum naturae, by which we give something to Christ. And we give things to Christ also in our daily lives. What is the purpose of our works, gifts of charity, when you help a beggar on the side of the street? What is the purpose of giving to the church, when you give money to the Father or to the church for its maintenance? In fact, the church should be the purpose of all gifts is the adoring and worship of God, a giving the gifts to God. God gave me my health. God gave me my clothing. God gave me my money. God gave me my possessions of all types. I must take something of each of these things and give them back to Him. That's what Tobias did in the Old Testament when he buried the dead. He was considering God. We are now towards the end of the world. We have to consider God. Now, God gave us these 7 sacraments. Baptism. And here I haven't been able to read the precise words yet. Father Hugo says he's going to read in the next few weeks one of his sermons. So in the near, not too distant future, of a priest who wrote a letter in 1801 to French Catholics. What do you do when you have no sacraments? We have a time of revolution now. We have a time of persecution now. We live often without the sacraments. But not only in our time of persecution do we live without the sacraments, but even in the normal times of the church, we often have to be without the sacraments. There's those people that live in the mountains. What about the sailors that got into the boat and went to the sea? And they had to go from one side of the world to the other. When the Spanish carried Christ and the Portuguese carried Christ from Europe all over the world, they brought Christ from Spain. They brought Christ from Portugal. They brought the Blessed Virgin Mary from Spain. The Blessed Virgin Mary told Santiago, says, you Spanish people, and this is before she died. She was not yet ascended into heaven or assumed into heaven. She appeared to St. James in Saragossa, Spain, only about 10 years after the crucifixion, maybe 15 years after the crucifixion. And she appeared to him and said, the Spanish, there are only 7 Spanish that converted. Low percentage. Our chapel here is bigger than that, so it's not too bad. St. James only had 7. 7 men, which he brought back with him to Jerusalem. And he said, these are the only 7 I've got. And St. Peter ordained them priests and bishops and said, go back. And they went back. The 7 converts and St. Santiago. And he already knew he would have victory when he went back, because the Blessed Virgin Mary appeared to him and said, don't worry, Spain, thick-necked and hard-headed, will convert and will be my apostle. They will be my principal apostles throughout the whole world. That wherever Spain goes, I will go. And we find that wherever Spain is, such as in Mexico, the Blessed Virgin Mary is there. In the Philippines, the Blessed Virgin Mary is there. Wherever Spain goes, and the same is true of Portugal, which was part of Spain at the time, wherever Spain and Portugal go, there's the Blessed Virgin Mary. And she said, don't worry, they're going to carry me to the end of the world. And they have. The greatest of all the missionary countries that the God has ever made. But these Spanish and Portuguese, they were not all saints. These conquistadors, they got into their boats, but they carried Mary and they carried Christ, and they had to go across the ocean. And they didn't have sacraments. They had long periods without the sacraments. But they brought Christ, and they came back and brought the priest, and they planted the cross. Because what is necessary? What is a sacrament? It's an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. It's supposed to give grace. It's a grace that's more important. St. Thomas Aquinas says we can have 3 things. We say the word grace in Latin. It's called res, which means thing in English. The thing. What happens? The thing happens. Res. Sometimes you have res et sacramentum, says St. Thomas. You have the thing and the sacrament, the grace and the sacrament, which is the outward sign. Sometimes you have only the sacrament, which would be the case when someone receives Holy Communion, for instance, unworthily. Or someone is baptized and they're not sorry for their sins and receive it sacrilegiously. Or receive marriage in a state of mortal sin. They receive the sacrament, but they don't receive the res. They don't receive the grace. Sometimes we receive res. Sometimes we receive res as sacramentum tantum, the sacrament only. Sometimes we receive res as sacramentum, the grace in the sacrament. And sometimes we receive res tantum. And what's the most important? The res. The res is the most important. The grace is the most important. And God sometimes gives a grace, even in the absence of the sacrament. Like, for instance, you're on the way to confession and you're sorry for your sins. You die on the way. You make a perfect act of contrition, and God forgives the sins. And what about those soldiers that died in the battlefield? The priest and the bishop used to bless the arms of the knights. Benedictio armis, armorum, the blessing of the arms, reserved to the bishop. So the knights would come in with their swords, and they would put their swords in front of the bishop, and he would bless them, and said, you when you are dying in the battlefield, take your sword and kiss it at the cross. Because you know every sword has a handle, and then it has a guard shaped in the form of a cross. It has a blade. This is your cross. With this cross, slay the enemies of God. With this cross, protect the widow and protect the orphan. With this cross, protect the honor of the church. And when you are dying in the battlefield, take the cross and kiss it, and you will receive a plenary indulgence. And so you see the soldiers in the battlefield dying, and there's no priest. They would take their sword by the blade, and take the sword and kiss it. And when they kissed that sword, they kissed the cross, they made an act of contrition for their sins, and they died, and they were forgiven their sins. It was as if they had gone to confession. And the priest telling the faithful at that time, 200 years ago, in a letter, says, look, many of our ancestors have had times without the sacraments. Many have died without them. Not just the famous case in Japan where they had 200 years without the sacraments. And there was a catechist, and the catechist would baptize, because a layman can baptize in the case of necessity if there's no possibility of the priest to baptize, and there's a danger of death. Then the layman can say, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And if we find ourselves without the sacraments, because of why? Because there are communists giving the sacraments. We don't go to communists. Because there are heretics giving the sacraments. We don't go to heretics. Because the sacraments are separated from the church. We don't go to those that are separated from the church. And then we have in our situation today a great age of confusion in which we have good men with a good heart, such as in the Society of St. Pius X, such as in the Fraternity of St. Peter, such as in the indult communities and the diocesan priests who are saying the Novus Ordo Mass and the Latin Mass. They accept Vatican II. They may not like it, they may like it, but they accept it, and this is against God. And though they might mean well, and thereby save their souls, but the fact is that they might mean well and have a faith somehow on the inside of them, but if they hold this truth, this to be true, which when they accept publicly, they are endangering souls and leading souls away from God. And what do we see? 50 years after the council, souls getting more and more away from God. We must have souls stand for God. And you can have a perseverance in the faith without always having the sacraments. Our ancestors have had it for 2,000 years. How do we prepare for the judgment? Live according to the faith today. Don't compromise the faith today. The first one that died was because of worship of God. He worshiped God pleasingly. Cain worshiped God displeasingly. Cain worshiped the true God, and his worship was not pleasing to God. Abel worshiped the true God, and his worship was pleasing to God. And if you were going to attend which worship, which would you go? Do you go to the sacrifice of Abel, or do you go to the sacrifice of Cain? You would go to the sacrifice of Abel. You would not go to the sacrifice of Cain. Because Cain, though he worshiped the true God, he was displeasing to God. He was filled with jealousy and hate. He really worshiped himself more than God. And how do we know that? He was an idolater of himself in reality. And why was that? Because he chose the best for himself and not the best for God. So how do we worship God when you don't have sacraments all the time? And we should do this even if we do have sacraments, and we should more. Follow the rule of St. Ambrose. We must do good for the neighbor. We must say the rosary each day. We must find a way to do works of charity for the neighbor. We must find a way to spread the faith. If I worship God, I must worship him publicly. What is the sacrifice? And the priest said, you know that the Mass is a sacrifice? Do you know that when you don't have Mass, that's a sacrifice? Can you unite your sacrifice of suffering without the Mass with the sacrifice of the Mass? Is it not better to offer the sacrifice of not having a sacrifice is to offer something up, to be suffering? You do not want to be without the Mass. Necessity has put you without the Mass. You don't want to be a long time without confession. Necessity has put you a long time without confession. And then it reminds you, I must be good because it's a long time to the next confession. And if I find myself full, then I must make a perfect act of contrition. And I make a greater act of contrition. And I'm more aware of my faith. Our ancestors have lived hundreds of years in mountains. They have lived all over the world. And some of them have gone many, many years without the sacraments. But they never went a moment without their faith. And they remembered the death of Abel. Maybe he died young. But his death was a beautiful death. And his death was a happy death. Because he died because he was a worshiper of the true God, and he worshipped him worthily. And whoever faces death, who worships the true God and worships him worthily, his death shall be beautiful. The age of his death matters not. And guess what happens to all those? And Abel is a warning. That's one reason why in the sacrament of confirmation, when you receive the true sacrament of confirmation, which is the traditional sacrament, what happens? You kneel down in front of the bishop and he gives you a slap. And why does he give a slap? Because if you are faithful, if you worship the true God from your heart, if you have the faith in your heart, if you make it the center of your life, you're going to get slapped. You're going to be attacked. You're going to experience pain. You will be persecuted. And that includes in the ages of faith. There isn't one saint that wasn't persecuted. There isn't one saint that didn't have to fight against heretics. St. Anthony lived in the 1200s. That's when he lived. He died around the year 1236, plus or minus. He was 36 years old when he died. And he died in the mid-1200s. It is the greatest century that has ever been. More saints in that century than any other. St. Dominic, St. Anthony himself, St. Francis of Assisi, St. Bonaventure, St. Thomas Aquinas. And the greatest glory of the church. And what is Anthony called? The hammer of heretics. Because in his 10 years of preaching, what did he have to deal with? Heretics. He had to deal with heretics. What did St. Dominic have to fight against? Albigensians. And the false poverty of they call themselves the poor ones, the false poverty, the demonic false poverty. St. Francis had to fight against them, the Cathars, and he had to fight against them. He had to fight against heretics. They had to fight against enemies of God. They had to fight against wicked emperors and wicked kings. They had to fight to save their souls, and they were all of them attacked and all of them persecuted. And the first one that loved God, the first one that held the truth, he was persecuted, and his name is Abel. And so therefore, when we go to the confirmation sacrament, you get a slap on the face. You will be persecuted. If you are not persecuted, you will be persecuted if you're faithful. And if you're not faithful, you will not suffer because of your faith. And that means you don't have it. You don't have it. If you don't suffer because of your faith, it means you don't have it. It's very simple. It means it's not the center of your life. It means it's not the most important thing. And so we shouldn't be overly disturbed that we must suffer a little bit. And God always provides. We go to the physical sacraments when it's possible to receive them in union with the church and in union with the faith. But we will not always be able to receive the physical sacraments. That time may come when young people have to marry themselves and no longer be married by the priest because you can't find a priest who's Catholic. You can't find a priest who believes in God in your area. And so they can marry. If there is no possibility of a priest, then a young couple can marry. They can get the monkeys to be witnesses if they're around no other human beings. If not, find a couple of idiots and they can be witnesses and sign a little paper. And you can raise a Catholic family. You can teach in the Holy Roman Catholic faith. You can say the rosary. When St. Francis Cabrini went up to the top of the mountain of Denver, over the Lookout Mountain, she looked over the city of Denver and she wanted to pray over that city. She felt the love for those people in that city. She wanted to pray to the Sacred Heart. She reached for a rosary. She didn't have a rosary. She lost it somehow along the way. She reached for a crucifix. She didn't have a crucifix. So what did she do? She spent about an hour. And she went looking for little white rocks that were about the same size. And she laid the rocks out in the form of a rosary, which is still there to this day. And then she made a cross out of stone. Took her a while. And then she prayed over the city. And how many souls were saved? She didn't have a rosary, but she had rocks. And she was able to make a cross out of rocks. She was able to make a rosary out of rocks. She was able to praise in front of the Sacred Heart. And a little bit later, one day they came to her and they said, you built an orphanage nearby here. That's why she was on top of the mountain. So you built a little place for your orphans down in Denver. They can't come up here because there's no water here. And she was carrying the staff that day, just like Moses. He said, you want water? Here it is. And she took the staff and she hit a rock and water came out. And the water feeds the cows and the animals in the mountain to this very day. Miracles still happen. And if we don't have a rosary, we can gather rocks. Soldiers used to take little peas and find when they were put in prison, take little bitty peas or take little stones and make a little rosary. We can do a sacrament, so to speak. The sacramental is also a sacrament instituted by Christ. And sacramentals remind us of Christ, the Holy Scapular, the Holy Rosary, the crucifix. You can kiss a crucifix. What do we say when someone's dying? If someone's dying, maybe the priest will be there near the death, maybe he won't. But kiss the crucifix like the soldiers used to kiss their sword. Say the name of Jesus over and over again. Speak to him. He will not abandon the soul. He will not. Because who is this judge? He is a most strict judge. He is a most strict judge. But when we see that judge, we will see, we will see this form coming at us in power and majesty, but then we'll see his face. It is the same face of him that hung on the cross. The same face of him that forgave the good thief. The same face that forgives anyone that is sorry for their sins. The same face that is ready to forgive the most wicked of all. Yes, he is most strict to those that don't turn to his mercy, and to those that don't turn to the love of him above all things. Then he's most strict. But if we turn to him, we'll find that when that judge comes, it'll be a most beautiful day. And then we find ourselves on the right side. And all the sins that we have committed in our lives shall be brought up. Every lie, every wickedness, every violation of all 10 of the commandments and all the virtues, every one of them shall be brought up. But we will see them as washed in the blood of the Lamb. We'll see them washed away by a good confession. And even if we cannot go to the Holy Sacrament of Confession when we're near death, you find yourself in a car accident, you find yourself flying, your plane decides to crash, you make a perfect act of contrition. You beg forgiveness for sins. And if it comes from the heart, it shall be forgiven. And Christ always gives the grace. Remember the word of St. Alphonsus. St. Alphonsus Liguori. As we live, so we die. Live with the love of God in the hearts. Abel did not know it was his day of death. He didn't even know that death, he heard it, that Adam told him there was going to be death, but nobody ever saw death before. Nobody knew what death was for human beings. He saw cows die, he saw sheep die, but didn't think it would happen to humans. He had no concept of death. But then Cain showed up and killed him and left him in a field filled with blood. He was the first one to learn what death was. What happened to him? Priest, innocent, shepherd, and he went into the bosom of Abraham before anyone else and waited to see Jesus Christ come 2,000 years later. And so he came. And he went into heaven with our Lord Jesus Christ. And he is a great saint to this very day. And he will be eternally seeing God face to face. And his 25 years on this earth and being the first one to die was most worth it. Most worth it. But in any case, how do we prepare for this judgment? How do we prepare for the judgment of God in our great crisis? Faith in the mind, faith in the heart, charity in our actions, love God above all things. And don't worry, God will never leave us abandoned. Even if it's not possible to go to confession, we can beg forgiveness from our hearts and we shall be forgiven. And God will take care of us, and he knows what's best. Sometimes when we get too many gifts, we become ungrateful and reserve judgment. So sometimes he gives us a little bit less in the way of gifts so that we remain grateful and we don't abandon the judgment and we are judged well. In any case, we persevere in the love of God in our hearts, prepare for this judgment well. And we'll close that. God bless you all. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.